Well, hello and welcome to the Quadruple D. So, on August 14th, 2025, hardline Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich moved to revive the long frozen E1 settlement project, signaling an abrupt push to carve up the West Bank and sever East Jerusalem from Palestinian areas. Described by Smotrich's office as a strategy to bury the idea of a Palestinian state, the plan authorizes the construction of 3,401 housing units near Ma'ale Adumim. So I had to look up how to pronounce that name because I'm not a native speaker of that language. But anyway, moving on. From a critical lens, this is a textbook expression of state expansionism, a calculated effort to consolidate territorial and symbolic control while undermining grassroots resistance to their authority. Smotrich declared that neither declarations nor documents would matter. Only on the ground, facts of houses, facts of neighborhoods would determine reality. That's what he said. And he invoked support from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump, who I wish I could say is a former U.S. president, but he's there now. And the E1 area, located northeast of East Jerusalem, stretches over approximately 12 kilometers squared. It shelters Bedouin communities like Khan el Amar and includes strategic installations such as an Israeli police headquarters and the temporary Bab el Shams encampment. The development, first proposed in the mid 1990s, has repeatedly stalled under international pressure. So, why does it matter? Why am I mentioning this? The E1 project would create a physical corridor of Israeli settlements around Jerusalem, effectively isolating Palestinian population centers. This fragmentation not only shreds the geographic and social fabric vital to Palestinian autonomy, it renders impossible any viable, contiguous two state solution. The international community, including the UN, EU, Norway, Qatar, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, has condemned the project. They emphasize that it violates international law, undermines the two state solution, and entrenches the occupation. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has sharply denounced Israel's creeping annexation of the West Bank, urging an immediate halt to unilateral moves that sabotage peace. Even prior to this, the United Nations had formally demanded that Israel end its unlawful presence in Palestinian territories, echoing an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice to comply within 12 months. Meanwhile, Palestinians and human rights groups, including Peace Now and Breaking the Silence, denounced Smotrich's announcement. Peace Now warned the government is driving us forward at full speed into an abyss, while Israeli soldiers groups labeled it a land grab, reinforcing apartheid. On the ground conditions reinforce the context of intensified state aggression. Reports estimate that since October 2023, over 61,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. That's a very conservative estimate, by the way. It's more likely over on 100,000 at this point, although it's hard to keep a reliable body count when the body count just keeps rising with seemingly each and every day. And settler violence in the West Bank has surged as well, a staggering increase in raids, demolitions, and civilian harm. Israel halted construction in 2012 on this project, and again in 2020 after mounting international backlash. Yet Smotrich now insists work will proceed if all bureaucratic approvals go through, Infrastructure could begin within months, and construction start within a year. So, from a from a sane perspective, this episode is emblematic of how states entrench power not through democratic consent, but through brute geography, using housing blocks, security zones, and planning laws to coerce control and preempt resistance. So the E1 project isn't just about concrete, it's a symbolic and physical assertion of dominance aimed at delegitimizing Palestinian self determination or self determination. Uh, I added a syllable or two on that word. Anyway, um, yeah, that was quite a mouthful, and it's going to be, a hell on earth, a furtherance of the hell on earth that has unfolded in recent years. So, on to the second segment of the show. I'm going to be talking about the peripheral poophead of the week, who is Itamar Ben-Gvir. Now, when I say he's on the periphery, that doesn't mean he has no power or anything like that. It just means that in this case, he's a far right catalyst, often overlooked in US media. So we're going to look at who this guy is. Far right Israeli minister Itamar Ben Gvir, widely ignored in American media, remains a significant agitator within Zionist politics. Born on May 6, 1976, in Mevaseret, Zion, he leads the extremist Otzma Yehudit, or the Jewish Power Party. This group is rooted in Kahanism, a violent exclusionary ideology advocating for the systematic removal of Palestinians from their land. It shares ideological roots with the outlawed Koch movement. Ben Gvir has accrued dozens of indictments and at least 8 convictions for incitement to racism and support for terrorism, specifically for promoting Koch propaganda. That's key or Kach, if you want to know how that word is spelled. And as a lawyer, Ben Gvir deliberately defends extremist Jewish militants in Israeli courts, portraying their actions as ideologically justified. And he himself lives in the Israeli occupied West Bank in the settlement of Kiryat Arba near Hebron, reinforcing his intimate ties to settler colonial power structures, if you will. So Ben Gvir has been a provocateur from early on. He infamously threatened Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin live on television in 1995, an event that seemingly foreshadowed Rabin's assassination because, yes, he was assassinated. And he once displayed a portrait of Jewish extremist Baruch Goldstein, who I'm going to get into in our third segment a little bit more. But Goldstein was known for perpetrating a mass killing of Palestinians, and the this Ben Gvir, he had a portrait of him in his living room. So that's just creepy, right? Like, I mean, to have a portrait of him in your living room, that's just sick. I mean, that's like even if I supported an extremist, I don't know if I would have a picture of them in my living room, but I suppose that's what makes you an extremist to begin with. You might prioritize the extremist members of a movement even over your own family. And in this case, he loved this terrorist so much that he has a picture of him in his living room. So he also called in 2019 for the expulsion of disloyal Arab citizens of Israel. And of course, disloyal can mean any number of things. You can just make that up as you go along. And he sparked violent clashes in East Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah in 2021. His repeated visits to the highly contested Temple Mount, where the Al Aqsa Mosque stands, ignited international outrage in 2023. And politically, Ben-Gvir served as Minister of National Security from December 2022 until his resignation in January 2025 in protest against a Gaza ceasefire deal. But after a brief withdrawal from government, he returned by March 2025 as Netanyahu's coalition faltered under mounting pressure. On June 10th, 2025, a watershed moment, five Western governments, that is, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway, imposed travel bans and asset freezes on Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Smotrich. These policies were framed as accountability for their incitement of extremist settler violence and systematic human rights abuses against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. In the UK's official statement, these ministers were held personally liable for serious abuses of Palestinian human rights, including calls for forced displacement and expanding illegal settlements, both threats to the two state solution. Canada enacted similar steps via amendments to its special economic measures, regulations, reinforcing asset freezes, and inadmissibility under its immigration law. So these sanctions occurred amid a sharp rise in settler violence and home demolitions, events marked by growing impunity backed by political figures like Ben-Gvir, a violent extension of state-enforced settler colonialism. Ben-Gvir responded defiantly. He said, we'll survive this. I will continue to work for the state of Israel, he said. And his rhetoric draws on religious symbolism, framing international pressure as existential threats, while maintaining his role as a state backed aggressor and symbol of resistance to global scrutiny and accountability. So, to put this in perspective, state repression through legal and financial means, the sanctions shows that even authoritarian actors face international constraints when their violence becomes too blatant. Yet these measures are limited. Politicians like Ben-Gvir continue to mobilize internal ideological and religious frameworks to evade accountability. The persistence of settler colonial violence calls for solidarity with Palestinian movements and ethical rejection of both formal and informal authority structures that legitimize occupation and dispossession and just sheer slaughter. So, this is a moment to amplify grassroots resistance, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or the BDS strategy. Human rights networks need to be supported, mutual aid, and direct solidarity across borders could provide transformative tools where state sanctions only go so far. So, all right, moving on to the third segment, which I always call the Fetid Fever Dream flashback of the week, we're going to look at the terror attack by Baruch Goldstein. It was obviously a big scandal. I mean, I don't need to explain why exactly, but I'm going to go through it anyway just to spell things out. So, Baruch Goldstein was the 1994 Cave of the Patriarchs massacre in Hebron um, leader. And here are the facts of what he did. So, Goldstein was an American born Israeli physician, an Orthodox Jew, and a member of the far right Koch movement, banned in Israel for racism and incitement, by the way. So there was a time, I don't know if Koch is still banned in Israel, but it is, or it at least was at some point. It might not be banned anymore. Anyway, what happened was on February 25th, 1994, during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, Goldstein entered the Ibrahimi Mosque, part of the Cave of the Patriarchs complex with an assault rifle and opened fire on Palestinian worshippers. He killed 29 people and injured over 120 before being beaten to death by survivors. So the aftermath, aside from having his face in certain people's living rooms, the massacre sparked massive unrest across the West Bank and Gaza, leading to further killings and a sharp deterioration in Israeli Palestinian relations. Goldstein was widely condemned, including by Israel's government at the time, but some far right settlers glorified him as a martyr. His grave became a shrine for extremists, despite laws banning such commemoration. And like I said, a certain somebody has his likeness in his living room. So, a well rounded analysis would likely focus less on Goldstein as an isolated madman and more on the structural and authoritarian conditions that produced him and people like him. State backed settler colonialism is a huge factor here. Goldstein operated in a context where the Israeli state has supported and protected settlement expansion in the occupied West Bank. While the government condemned him afterward, the policies that normalized settlers' armed presence and dominance over Palestinians were ongoing. And so was the militarization and hierarchy, of course. Israeli and countless other societies are deeply militarized, with strict hierarchies, nationalist narratives, and segregation, conditions that breed dehumanization and justify violence against the other. And of course, there is a religious nationalist ideology as a tool of power that is also being factored in here. Goldstein's act was rooted in a fusion of Zionism and ultra Orthodox religious fundamentalism. I tend to see such ideologies not as purely faith, but as instruments of control, rallying people behind leaders and states that benefit from perpetual conflict. So there really is a cycle of authoritarian violence, and his attack triggered more state crackdowns, curfews, and military operations. In simple terms, one authoritarian act, his massacre, was used to justify further authoritarian measures by states and armed factions on both sides, entrenching the cycle. Now, I kind of hate to both sides it for obvious reasons, but there's nevertheless truth to that. And you also have individual agency versus structural violence going on here as a possible side issue. Like, what should people focus on? So, again, focusing solely on Goldstein's personal evil obscures the systemic violence of occupation, checkpoints, land confiscations, and daily harassment, as well as the more blatant violence that has occurred. And these were all forms and still are forms of slow violence that make massacres like Hebron part of a broader continuum rather than mere aberrations. So we should condemn Goldstein's massacre outright, but also insist that it was not some anomaly. It was an extreme manifestation of the same authoritarian, colonial, and nationalist structures that perpetuate oppression, not just in the region, but beyond. Because, the old school formulation is that so long as one group of people is oppressed, we're all oppressed. Just because we're not being targeted yet doesn't mean that similar efforts could not end up targeting whatever group you are a part of or whatever group your neighbors are a part of. So authoritarian movements should be rejected far and wide, and for the very same reasons that I've gone over. You know, they they always feed into violence. Violence begets violence. However you want to phrase it, it's a classic formulation. But anyway, that's it for today's episode. It wasn't a very fun episode, but hopefully you were given some food for thought. And well, check out my other episodes. They're not all political, of course. If you look at my podcast, you see I've got other topics, including movies and things that are sometimes considered distractive. But I like to have my podcast really involve a lot of different topics, just basically anything that comes to mind regarding life itself, and that can include politics, movie reviews, talking about social issues, practically anything that seems interesting to talk about, music, etc. All right, have a good day.